Hello and welcome to a brand new episode of Gut Spiller. I don't know what episode this is going to be because I'm recording loads and then just putting them out as and when, but today I'm speaking to David. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, so I'm David Burke, that's my last name. I've done promoting, I've done journalism, I've done a couple of bands, I've started a new project this year, but I guess the kind of thing that I'm probably, or certainly the thing that I want people to know me for as regards metal, is that I do a PhD about metal culture, so I'm like a sociologist and I study metal.
Yeah, so tell us about your band then, because you've told me a bit and it's definitely kind of a novel approach. It's not your standard approach to a band.
Yeah, so the band's called Absent Signifier, and at the moment it's me with T. Coles, who used to drum for a band called Sail, and they're also the author of a book about death metal from the 33 and a Third series. And the pitch of the band, I had this chat with them last year, and they said to me, because they were just coming out of their previous band, and they were saying, "Go on, give me the craziest pitch that you got." I was like, "Yeah, fine." So, because I've had this idea for quite a long time, about 8 or 9 years was when I had the original idea for this. So Absent Signifier is a free metal band. That's what we self-describe as. So what this involves is complex, structured improvisations using metal textures and styles. So in a single song, we'll try and go through a bit of grind, a bit of sludge, a bit of trad metal, maybe a bit of Manowar worship. Why not? But then also ambient sections and so on, all kind of jumbled up and all decided basically on a whim. And we have a system of hand gestures and signs that we use to tell each other what we're going to play next. It's currently early days. We've done about 5 gigs so far, and we're going to go into do a split fairly soon. But it's coming along pretty well, and yeah, like the normal reaction we get after a gig is, "Oh, I've never heard anyone play anything like that," which is a pretty good start, I think. So yeah, that's what we're up to at the moment.
Yeah, and I was saying, because, you know, when I found out about your band, I wanted to go and listen to it, but there's not really any music online, and you said that's not really a priority for you right now.
No, not at all. I think T thinks more that getting stuff recorded is worth the time, and like I'm happy to go on and get some stuff recorded. That's fine, but it is kind of an afterthought for me. What interests me about doing this band is the process of learning to play this kind of music, because I've never played anything like this before, and teaching each other how to react, not just to playing, like jamming with each other, but also like how to respond quickly and maintain eye contact and that kind of thing. And this is just at the beginning of the process. Like the idea that I had 8-9 years ago involves digital screens and foot switches that can trigger basically like a slide deck featuring really complex musical information, and we would like vote to proceed through the deck and that kind of thing. And then there are all these like game elements as well, where we would try and like play against each other. So we have a song at the moment called Quick Draw, where we have a first act, and then you change to the second act by one of us shooting the other, like a quick draw. But we don't know, neither of us know when we're going to get shot. So it's a surprise, and then the other person shoots back to change from the second act to the third. So that's the kind of thing and that's for me that's the first game. That's a simple game that doesn't require too much like fooling around. Like the main influence for this project is John Zorn, who some listeners might know from his work with Mick Harris on Naked City and Painkiller, which are these projects from the early 90s. But Zorn did this whole series of really complicated game pieces, which are incredible to watch. There's a video of one called Cobra on YouTube, which I really recommend people checking out to see the kind of vibe that we would like to get to, but we're doing on a much kind of smaller, more DIY kind of scale.
Yeah, it's just it just sounds insane, and it's funny because Tia's put us on in the past, so I know them through that, and obviously I bought the book as well. So it's two very kind of intellectual people starting a band, and I guess that's what you'd expect. These are crazy concepts coming from it.
Yeah, like we went into this kind of knowing that as well. So like the photo shoot that we've done so far, and like how the band is like the aesthetics are all very like I call it academic core. Like T wears a turtleneck when they play. Like I haven't stepped up to the plate yet because I'm a massive poser, but it's certainly like a part of what we want to do is very like self-consciously intellectual, wanky, frankly.
Yeah, well, at least you admit it. And yeah, you're also a promoter, and you know, I guess promoters have got to stick together, and I always empathize when you put your posts online just telling people a bit about what it is to be a promoter and how it isn't always the most fun thing in the world. You know, do you want to talk a bit about that? Because it's something that is kind of one of the things I want to talk about on this podcast, basically.
It's really interesting you mentioned that, right? Because like for the PhD, one of the things I'm doing is collecting social media posts from various sources, and sometimes meme pages and shit posting groups, and also like festival groups where people are posting about upcoming gigs and that kind of thing. And last year, the festival that I run, Abyssal, which is this little one-dayer in Southampton, though we have expanded the venue this year. Last year, we were in a pretty tight spot as it approached the festival line, as it got close to the date. We hadn't sold that many tickets. And I posted something which said, customarily frank, oh shit, we haven't got that much sold post. Because and that's not just because I wanted to be upfront, though I think that is also the case. You do want to be upfront with your fans, but that's and the punters, the people that are going and putting their money in. But also because that is part of metal DIY Facebook posting. It's conventional for festivals and promoters to do a kind of candid, I'm gonna tell you what's what. Here's a little bit of financial information, perhaps, to kind of show you that we're not messing you around. We're trying to establish a kind of authentic link between the promoter and the fan. And I find this really common amongst a certain group of more independent metal festivals.
I feel like I'm being psychoanalyzed.
So yeah, I posted on all that. Sorry?
I feel like I'm being psychoanalyzed here.
Yeah, well, I mean, I say I've been like observing how people post on metal Facebook for the past kind of 3 or 4 years and taking notes, as it were, and I think this is a really good. To be honest, I think this is a really nice thing. I think it's one of the good things that the metal that is common in the metal community. Also, kind of in DIY music more broadly, but there's a certain kind of very direct address that I find is common amongst metal groups. For instance, like, you know, Gav from Damnation, he posts this kind of sellout-ometer quite a lot, where he's got like a fill-up bar indicating how many tickets they've sold, and there are various kind of checkpoints along the way indicating when they break even, when they're doing okay, and so on and so forth. And I was really kind of I found that kind of candor really touching, because they don't need to be that honest with the fans. But there's something about establishing good rapport in a DIY scene that is really well reflected there.
Yeah, I think you can play it two ways in my head. You can be really transparent, or you can just say nothing. And the second approach, I mean, they're both valid. It depends what you're trying to do. I think the first approach tends to come about when you've not sold enough tickets. Like the ideal, the ideal is that you sell loads of tickets and then you don't need to make a post about it, and you don't need to even let on that there was any hint that this event you're putting on might not be a success.
Sure.
And then, speaking from my experience and knowing your experience and Gav's, the post comes about when you are trying to sell more tickets, essentially, because you're kind of letting people know the reality of the situation, which is actually really necessary, because in what we do, can't even call it a business because it's the opposite of business, because we lose money.
Sure.
It's very important for people to know that these events are on a knife edge, and if they don't actually support it, then it's not going to happen for them. And you don't want to get into that guilt trip thing where it's like, you must support your scene or there'll be no scene. I try not to do that with my posts. I just try and be, like you say, frank, and just be like, look, or just hint that if you want this to happen, you've got to buy tickets. I don't say it like that, but that's kind of what I'm trying to get across a lot of the time, or just to let people know that it isn't all fun, because I very rarely find promoting fun, and it kind of annoys me a bit when people assume that I'm having a really good time doing this, because I'm not. And I do find I am, for whatever reason, I fall on the end of the spectrum that doesn't have fun. I know people that do have fun, and I know people that kind of just like meh, and I'm just like, it's not really fun for me. I do it because if it doesn't get done by me, at least where I used to live, it's not getting done in a way. Do you know what I mean? So I just feel like this DIY duty to do it, but I wouldn't say I enjoy it.
No, I think this reminds me a lot of something that's in my supervisor's book. So he wrote a book about extreme metal. The guy's Keith Kahn Harris. Some listeners might know. But he talks in there about there's two kinds of subcultural capital that are operative in metal scenes, like things that people respect you for, or like a sense, what clout would be the normal colloquial term. And one half of this is transgressive subcultural capital, like being the most shocking, having the most outrageous performances, or the newest sound, or whatever it is. And the other side is mundane subcultural capital. And promoting is you get mundane capital from that. Like, people respect you, but it entails all of this admin work, all of this like hurry up and wait, endless chasing emails because you're waiting for so and so to get back to you, and now you need to rearrange the lineup because you need. For instance, we're thinking at the moment for this year's Abyssal, we're thinking about how to set up the lineup so that there's minimum faff with tech changeover. And that's not a very rock and roll thing to think about, perhaps, when you're planning a lineup, because normally, I guess, you'd want to think about, let's try and get all the sounds to be in the best order possible, try and make the best concert-going experience or whatever. But behind that, there's all of these pragmatics, and you've got to figure out parking, getting the stuff on and off stage in 20 minutes. No, this person doesn't like their amp being touched by other people, so we can't use that. This person only accepts payment in precious metals or whatever. There's all of these annoying day-to-day decisions that and just like, it's like running a small business, but you get, as you say, you don't get paid anything for it.
Yeah, it's not very rock and roll, is it? Setting a show up. It's kind of,
No,
it really is the opposite.
I feel like journalism is also a lot like that. Certainly in like in my time of being like I edit Astral Noise. It's kind of fallen a bit by the wayside these days, but I was editing for a few years, and there, rather than the vision of somebody like Lester Bangs or Robert Christgau working their way through the stack of records that appear on their desk every week and finding random gems that they then get to curate for a mass audience and people genuinely care about it. My experience of doing web journalism is like a true Sisyphean labour. You know, there's infinite music to listen to. A lot of it, unfortunately, is very sound-alike as well. You know, a lot of it is kind of repetitive and reminds you of other things, and it's pretty competent and well put together, and maybe there's a good producer on it to give it that nice polish, but it's not the most interesting thing you've ever heard. And then you create the article, and maybe 100 people read it, and I know from looking at the stats on the WordPress back end, you know how many people read your articles. It's not... You're speaking to relatively few people, and that's not the same experience as the kind of golden era of rock criticism was at all. On the other hand, keeps people occupied, doesn't it?
It's just journalism. That's a whole nother issue. I mean, I've dabbled in it, but I can imagine in the case of something like Astral Noise, who've been very big supporters of our band. It's kind of like, if you post a bad review, the band aren't going to share it. So the only people that are going to see it are your fans, whereas it's like you really need the band to get on board with whatever you're posting so that they share it with their followers. And so that's why you end up with this just like backslapping thing where it's not real music criticism. It's just kind of like an extension of PR, basically.
Yeah, that's. I went on a podcast earlier this year and described this exact process. Like when I was reviews editor at Astral, I created this policy that said no bad reviews unless it's for a big band. In which case there's an opportunity to have some kind of genuine criticism about how the music industry works, or a good opportunity to write funny. You know, if the album is so bad that you can write a funny review out of it, then that was acceptable. But in all other cases, I said I don't want to see a bad review. But that really puts pay to the issue, right? Like it's much harder to be a critic when you don't actually curate for people. You're not actually all of this. I find all of the gatekeeper discourse that is happening online now kind of amusing, because to be honest, I think all the gatekeepers have gone. That function doesn't really exist in the way that it used to 20, 30 years ago, when old media and the lack of an internet meant that a certain kind of person really did control what thousands and thousands of people listened to on a week-by-week basis, whereas now gatekeeper largely seems to refer to people that say that they don't like normally a metalcore or deathcore band. That seems to largely be what it actually refers to.
I've got a lot that I want to talk to you about. Do you want to just set the scene by saying kind of what you're specialising in at the moment and what your thesis is about? I know you've touched on it. But...
Yeah.
Sure. So my thesis is about... It's about the... I'm writing the literature review at the moment, so this is on my mind. But it's about the persistence and continuity of metal. Now, lots of journalists and academics as well have claimed that metal is continuous and persistent. It has this kind of lastingness. Maybe we can point to the way that, 55 years down the line, people are still doing Sabbath worship. for instance. I don't know any band, by the way, who would be doing anything like that, just retreading Black Sabbath riffs for fun and profit,
Oh yeah,
certainly not.
No one.
Nobody, right? So on the one hand, there's arguments that metal's really quite coherent and persistent, and then on the other, there are people that say, oh well, this genre doesn't count. Oh, this part of metal isn't true. Oh, this era of metal is completely distinct from the other eras, and so on and so forth. And what I'm interested in, what my research is about, is finding ways in which metal culture has either persisted or has kind of broken away, and sort of coming to an understanding of whether metal culture is as persistent as it claims itself to be. But in a broader sense, I'm also dealing with a social phenomenon that I noticed before I started the PhD, so now we're talking best part of 5 years ago now, which was how normalised and accepted metal was becoming, and how non-threatening a lot of metal is now to the broader culture. And I think now, following from that starting point where in the past couple of years metal has kind of had a popular revival to an extent and is becoming much, much bigger than it has been in the previous sort of 15 years or so, I think. It's an interesting time to be dealing with these kinds of questions, I think, because metal's now having its fourth big popular moment. The original one is like with Sabbath and Zeppelin in the late 60s, early 70s. Then you got the 80s glam stuff, the turn of the millennium, new metal and pop metalcore moment, and now there's a popular wave of kind of trap metal, deathcore, and to a lesser extent like doom and stoner metal, which are now kind of, I think of them as kind of stand-ins for what used to be hard rock, and a lot of people that are into hard rock or would have been into hard rock in the 70s and 80s are now really into doom. So it's an interesting time to be talking about how metal has lasted but may have changed, but also has become, over the course of its life, has become a lot more accepted and legitimate than it used to be.
I don't know, I think like even growing up when 20 years ago, it felt like you were alternative or whatever. You were doing something that a lot of people looked down on, but you did it anyway. And now it's kind of just like this sense of, well, I still love it, I still love what it is, but it doesn't mean the same thing to me anymore. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and that's exactly what my project is really interested in, is now that the transgression, and the transgressive subcultural capital that I talked about with my supervisor's book, that concept doesn't work as well as it used to. He was writing about the extreme metal scene in the early 2000s and was commenting a lot about the stuff that had happened in the 90s. So transgression was still a big part of the culture back then, with like Helvet, then new metal like Marilyn Manson and Columbine and all of these like shocking events that really disturbed contemporary morality, and metal was kind of aligned to shocking and disturbing forces back then. But it isn't now. And the question then is, what does that mean? What are we... If the shock and awe has gone, but we still like making it, that means that the culture now means something different. And part of my project is really kind of underneath the discussions about the kind of empirical discussions about how well has this thing lasted and how normal really is it. Underneath that, there's a deeper question about what does metal mean when it doesn't shock your mum and dad anymore, or it doesn't shock your church leader because you don't care about your church leader because nobody goes to church anymore.
So are you allowed to kind of give, I don't know, are you allowed to at this point say Because
Oh yeah,
it sounds like
yeah,
you're
yeah.
answering a question. You're answering your hypothesis.
Sure. Yeah, sure. So I think for a lot of people, metal's meaning is now much more ethically inflected. People do metal bands because they want to they still feel that they're against the norms of society, but just being shocking doesn't seem to work in the same way. So instead, a lot of metal bands will put a political slant on it, or kind of some sort of social conscience. Maybe a green slant, an environmentalist kind of bent, perhaps. Or maybe you'll substantiate it by referring to a forgotten part of history or culture that in the creator's mind deserves legitimacy and deserves exploration. And it gains this kind of worthiness, I think. A lot of metal feels very kind of adult and serious now. And yeah, taken up with ethics, I think. And this, I think, is one new meaning that has arisen. Part of that, I think, is the ongoing relationship between metal and punk, where punk has now informed metal such that a lot of metal bands have brought not just the DIY ethos, but also some of the policies from punk politics to an extent. But I also think that there's a further meaning beyond this, because there are loads of bands who don't give a flying fuck about politics and are still playing out the metal tropes, despite the shock having gone from them as well. So there's loads of bands that operate without shock or ethics. Now, what are they about? My contention there is that this is getting a little more complex and theoretical, but my basic idea there is that metal touches on certain concepts from psychology, and particularly Freudian psychoanalysis, extremely strongly, and it articulates basically a kind of a response to certain parts of our psyche that is just very difficult for people to let well enough alone, and basically riffs touch people in a way that gets beyond even shock and awe, and also because not just because riffs are the right kind of deviancy, the right kind of way to go against the norm. No, people like riffs because distortion indicates something kind of beyond or outside of normal experience, and people will return to that over and over again, even without the ability to shock people and without the ability to say something meaningful or ethical. People return to riffs just because there's something in there that attracts them on a psychic level. It's not, and this is basically the long way round of saying riffs good. Yeah, riffs are good, but how? It would be the further question there.
So, but now, even though, as we say, there's very little shock value to it, there is still some, and there is almost an apathy to it from still the vast majority of at least the UK's population, which kind of still makes it transgressive to me, because it's like, I said this on another podcast that I recorded recently, but in our band we have this thing where it's like we're pushing back. It's like we always say war on reality, because what we're doing is almost futile, and we're destined to lose money. We're destined to lose, time. It's not a waste because we're getting something from it, but we're just ploughing all this energy into something which is just not going to hit with 95% of society. And that, for me, defines now why we do metal. Because for me, when you are able to still do something that is so almost pointless to the majority of the population, your intent is truer.
Oh, wow. I mean, I completely agree. Like, the way that I would characterise that is that metal makes explicit the sacrifice of making music. We pour we pour all this time and this energy in, and obviously not just for the band. Like we've already talked about the sacrifices, the needless sacrifices that we undergo to make events happen. All of this busy work that normally, like, you know, I've chosen to be an academic so that I don't have to do that kind of like mundane sorting things out kind of paperwork. I can be a fancy lad and just read and write nonsense all day, you know. But it's this, it's a sacrifice, and also the way you described it as a kind of futile challenge is very existentialist. Is what you're articulating. This kind of like, well, I will set myself. It's like Camus' quote, "One must imagine Sisyphus happy." That's not a joke. Like, we should imagine the guy pushing a rock up a hill with no end in sight. We should imagine him happy, for real, because that kind of futility is present in every artistic project, and I think metal makes that very, very clear. In you know, like the number of albums and songs that are about how pointless and grandiose the struggle of whatever is. Really, they're referring to the process of making their own music. People that are in the independent side of the industry are always going to say, largely I think, are going to say that smaller fan base, smaller band equals truer music. As I say, like I have a weird take. Like even though I'm very much invested in doing DIY and keeping thing, and I like small room, like, and most of the gigs that I go to are small room, largely because I can't afford big room gigs. Anyway, they're getting so expensive now. What, like £100, 80 quid or whatever. But so to some extent I agree with you, but I also think that I have to keep this window open for the idea of mass appeal and the thought of, like, what I think of it as like a giant sales pipeline in a way. You know, the kids that hear Slipknot, well, that was me, a kid hearing Slipknot when I was like 12, 13, is the reason that I got into doom, death, grind, black, whatever later on. One has to imagine kids listening to baby metal or Lorna Shore, and some of them will go through the same process and become extreme metal fans by being exposed to this. And the tension there, I think, is actually the extreme metal fans coming to understand or deal with how they passed into the DIY scene through mass mediation. You know, they had to, like most metal fans, have to experience big commercial metal first before getting exposed to the harder shit. And while we might try, once we're in the DIY scene, to say, well, yeah, we don't want anything big, we don't want things to be too commercial, too successful, too popular. We all started there. We all got signposted in through your Guns N' Roses, your Linkin Parks, your whatever.
Oh yeah, no, I completely agree. And I still listen to big metal bands now. I'm just, but I don't think they're true.
Yeah, I get it.
You know, and I think your ears and your whole body becomes accustomed. Like, so, you know, when you're a kid, you're listening to Limp Bizkit on Kerrang, and it's blowing your mind, and it's like so heavy, and it's making you feel a certain way. That's great.
Yes.
You get older, and it doesn't hit in the same way because you've built up that tolerance to the extremity of the sound, and so you have to keep going. For me, like, truer and truer, to still keep that excitement and to still get something from the music that really reaches inside you, because you've kind of become a little jaded and hardened to the effect that the music first had on you, or that metal first had on you. So
Yeah.
that's how I see extreme metal. It's like a cave that you're just walking, and it's just getting darker and darker, and you've just got this little torch, and you're seeing all sorts of horrible things on your
Yeah.
way. But you just going to. It's like what's that band? Last Days of Humanity. Do you know them?
Yes.
Do you remember they were in that meme with the characters from Sesame Street?
Yes, I think so.
There's that like it wasn't a meme. It was so long ago that memes didn't exist. It was like a viral video where Bert and Ernie, they go and a 1 and a 2 and a 1 2 3, and then like this grindcore starts. And so the first time I heard that, it would have been like I'd laugh and then like move along. But now, and this is not to brag, but I'm at that point where those sounds are pleasant to my ears, and I will actually choose to put them on. And it's like it's almost like I'm happy that I've learned to see the beauty in something that, to again, the vast majority of the population, again, I'm not saying this to brag, but it's like your little secret that only you can enjoy, because the other people can't even comprehend it sense-wise. Like, it comes into them and it's just like white noise, and they're like, no, turn it off. It's like nightmares. But for me, it's like that's the journey I'm on. It's like learning to see the intent behind that music and what it means, and that's what keeps me going. It's like pushing beyond the sound to get to the emotion of it, but you've had to work to get there. It's been like a life's work to find that pleasure, if you want to call it that.
Yeah. I there are loads of things to bounce off there, because like, firstly, the idea of making listening to music into a life's work again is like, there's the sense of setting yourself up for a struggle or for a challenge, like making it into a task, you know. And there's also like the thrill of transgression is also the thrill of occultism, you know, like having a secret is transgressive, you know, nobody else gets to have my super secret information, nobody else gets to, you know, like, because I really resonate as well with that journey. Like, the kinds of things that I listen to now are largely the bands that have excited me over the past 5-6 years are things like Imperial Triumphant, or like Krallis, or Ad Nauseam, and then and Duma as well, who are this Kenyan kind of mix of trap, grindcore, black metal, and noise. And the stuff that I'm into is really, really fucking horrible and unlistenable. And for me though, it's, there's this kind of digging deeper and deeper and deeper, the kind of almost like Dante's descent into hell, and it just gets worse and worse as you go. But there's also a kind of silliness that comes with it, and the more that I listen to metal, the more I realise that yes, this is bad. This is shit. You know, this doesn't sound good. And that doesn't mean that I don't like it. It doesn't mean that I don't enjoy it, because I really, really do. But the more I listen, the more I come to terms. The thing I do is come to terms with the fact that I don't like good art. I like art that is bad. Whereas I think people who don't like metal have some idea that art is meant to be good in some way. And I think even the people that really like clean sounding metal, like gent or prog or symphonic power, people that are into those kinds of metals, they also have an idea that art is meant to be good in some way. But I think the more distorted it gets, and the more harsh it gets, the more likely you're going to be able to come to terms with that you like things that aren't good. You like it when it sounds horrible. You like it when it's too noisy. You like it when it sounds like it was recorded down the bottom of a well, etc. All the tropes that you've heard before, you know, when guitarists call their tones filthy or disgusting or horrible, you know, it's all extreme metal allows us, I think, to really come to terms with the aesthetic bad.
If, like we're saying, filthy, disgusting, all that stuff, somehow it makes us feel good. It's like it energizes us, and we kind of get off on the extremity. That's fun, and that's exciting, and that's enjoyable in a way. Do you think there's a tendency for, if you surround yourself with this stuff all the time, and completely live a life that is surrounded by the darkness, which generally, most metal music is dark, right? That's probably one of its main defining traits. Evil, darkness, negativity. That it's not healthy.
Oh, this is good. So, in the 80s, when people started to write about metal, it wasn't in a very flattering way. Largely, it was teams of psychologists who were trying to get research funding, and this was during the Reagan and Thatcher era. So, a lot of the research funding was being awarded to projects that could try and prove a relation between metal music and youth delinquency. Now, these studies weren't very well done, I would hasten to add, and largely consisted of deliberately misreading metal lyrics so that there was no ambiguity in them at all, and tried to turn them into direct instructions to commit suicide or commit crimes. Then the 90s happened, and the first wave of metal studies comes out, and the portrayal gets a lot more sympathetic. And then from the 2000s, people return to psychology and start writing papers that go the opposite way. Now there's a whole host of papers that have come out in the past 15 years which say, actually, no, listening to metal is a healthy outlet for negative emotions. It's a good way to engage in various forms of emotional catharsis, dealing with trauma, working through difficult periods in people's lives, etc., etc. And these studies largely rely on interviewing metal fans and getting them to talk about their experiences and what they use metal for. And this is all well and good. I think I much prefer the second kind of paper to the first. But I also think that on some level, where there's smoke, there's fire, right? Like, I don't surround myself with all of the dark and horrible imagery of metal for no reason at all. Does it make my life worse? No, I don't think so. But it's certainly a sign of it's a sign of the scars, as it were. And on another level, however, I think metal is bad for you in the sense that it constantly places you in situations where you're drinking, using other drugs, you're up late all the time, you have to lug all of this heavy gear around, and the older you get, the more likely it is you're going to put your back out doing it. You've got to sit in the van for like days at a time. You live off pasties. It's not good. You know, there are lots of parts of living the life of being in a band that are not healthy, and yet it draws people to it all the time. There's no higher achievement in the metal community than being in a band. Basically, it's the top. It's the thing that fans want to do, and it's the thing that musicians think about doing a second one of if they've got a spare half an hour a week or whatever. So I think it's a complex picture. I think overall, like, I certainly don't believe in any of the hysterical articles claiming that Marilyn Manson caused the Columbine massacre, to return to a previous point. but neither do I believe fully that metal is actually, it's just another great mental health tool, like using a mindfulness app or going for a nice walk. Like, I don't believe that either.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I remember when I used to go to a gym a few years ago, I met one of these people, well, I met a few people. I used to go in the sauna, right? It just reminded me of something else. And I had a very kind of hippie friend, and I liked talking to her, but, you know, she couldn't get on board with metal because she said that thing, oh, it's just all screaming and loud noises. But she used to say to me, be careful, because it'll lower your vibration. So obviously, like a very hippie thing to say.
Frequencies, yeah.
But I think there's a grain of truth to it. I really do, because, you know, everyone knows that when you listen to happy music, you generally feel happy. And it's such a fine line. It's like you say, it's like, are we doing this for catharsis? If so, that's fine. But is there a point where it tips over into like wallowing that is kind of creating an atmosphere? Because, you know, in our house, well, there are people that put horrible imagery all over their walls and stuff, but that's not me. You know, I wouldn't want to walk into a house and see like gore on the walls, shall we say. And I wouldn't want to eat a horrible meal. And I wouldn't necessarily want to watch horror films like all the time. Like, that's all that I watch. To be honest, there probably are people like this. But do you know what I mean? Why do we want to listen to metal all the time when it's the most horrible of musics? These are just the kind of things I think about. Like, at what point does it kind of step over into, I don't know, just like because we want our lives to be good, you know? We want to be successful. And we want to...
do we? Well, do we? You know, that's... And this is why I find it to... I'm going to make this quite brief, but this is basically why Freud is so useful for metal, because he has this concept called death drive, which is the idea that we don't want what's in our best interest all the time. And we don't always act to that interest. And we like... maybe doing things that are self-destructive, and we like hurting ourselves on some level, perhaps. And I mean, anybody that's a drinker or a smoker, I think, can put pay to this, really. Like, there's anyone that's had a hangover, and I smoke, and you're so conscious of the self-destruction that you're wreaking on yourself when you do something like that. And I think metal has benefits in some regard, but I also absolutely think that on a certain level, it's because we can't leave this darkness alone. It's not just enough to be fascinated with it. It's to be fascinated and keep coming back, to return, to cycle around over this disturbing nothingness, you know, like this darkness. And really, I think what we're touching on here is how our mode of enjoyment, the way that we articulate how we take pleasure in and become excited by the world, has nothing to do, or is only tenuously linked with what is rationally a good thing for us to do. I think this comes out in many other forms in other pieces of culture, right? But the thing about metal is that it's very, very explicit. It's very clear that we are doing something self-destructive because there are human skulls all over the artwork, and gore and all of this nasty, nasty shit that's almost saying to you, yeah, you're doing something destructive, maybe even self-destructive here. Whereas in pop music, in chart pop, the fans there, they are also committing to a self-destructive moment. They go out and drink. They also throw all of their hard-earned disposable income at Taylor Swift and go and see her for 200 quid a night, just so that they can stand up for 3 hours, get sore feet, pay another 100 quid getting the beers in, and hear and hear 20 songs, some of which are good, most of which you know the words to, and that's the important bit, and then you go home. And this also has a streak running through it of self-destructiveness, of sacrifice, as I said before. But in pop music, it's repressed. It's kept under control and or registered as, well, obviously you've got to treat yourself. But it's not like metal where it's like, no, keep going round on this horror. Never let it go, in fact.
I've actually got, because I put in my Instagram story that I'm speaking to someone with a PhD on metal this evening, and I got a couple of people saying, "Oh, ask them this." So,
yeah, great, please.
First one, do you know David from Omadon?
No, I don't. Is he an academic?
He is, but not for metal.
Right.
I think
right,
some
okay.
kind of Chinese studies. But so it's not a surprise to get a question from him. But he said, "How will you address tensions between metal as a media narrative and metal as an everyday practice?"
Oh, what a great question. So this is one of the precise issues that plagues how metal studies works, right? There are some people who are very focused on the media end of things, and they only write papers about journalism, basically, and don't ever talk to the fans. And then you've got other researchers who think that you can only understand metal by talking to the fans, and they don't think about how this is also a series of media institutions, and you kind of also see people's tastes work themselves out in there. The people that like talking to people in the streets on the kind of scenic level, on the level of individual metal scenes, funnily enough, those people tend to prefer extreme metal in their personal tastes, whereas the people that write about journalism tend to be more interested in the more commercially available ends of the spectrum. And you get this all the time in cultural studies. People's tastes get in the way of good research. Now, how am I going to address this tension, Dave from Omadon, is by doing way too much data work, basically. I've got 4 different evidence bases, 2 of which are on the level of the street and involve me going to gigs, and also an auto-ethnography, so writing about my own experiences in a band. And then the other 2 things are media studies, where I'm looking at social media and the lyrics of a selection of albums. So that's basically by having way too much data and kind of jack of all trades, master of none. That's how I'm going to deal with it.
Do you ever feel like you've ruined metal for yourself?
All the time.
Why? What possessed you to want to follow this with such passion?
Oh my god. Well, long story short, I first wanted to write about metal academically when I was like 15 or 16 years old, because I saw a documentary on BBC 4 about metal and decided, oh yeah, that looks like something I could do, which tells you everything you need to know about like my class background, like how much of a nerd I am and so on, that I was watching BBC 4 at age like 15. That's poor. But and then I went to university and I was like, I want to write about metal. So I wrote about doom metal for my undergrad dissertation, then again for my master's dissertation. And then I was like, oh, that was pretty fun. You know, I got to write about lyrics, and I got to show people all of these great stoner metal artworks that I was listening to at the time. Wonderful. And then I started the PhD, and I absolutely ruined my experience of metal for myself. But I also, in doing so, I came up with a whole new way of appreciating metal, which is the kind of this thing that I told you before about how I like it despite knowing that it's bad. Like that's how I was able to reconcile myself. Like I listened to it, and then I read about it, and I read about all these horrible things that happen in metal, you know, like all of the commercial negotiations that go on, the ways people treat each other, the ways people treat women, the ways people treat non-white people, etc., etc., etc. I learnt about all of this and came to an understanding that, right, okay, I have to deal with the fact that I like this culture that has all of these problems in it. And eventually, through lots of chewing, I got to the understanding that I like shit.
What? So when you say bad, what do you mean exactly? Because I take it you don't just mean it's shit.
I mean it both in the utterly pejorative sense of, oh yeah, that is shit, but also in the subtler sense of that this is a failure by normative aesthetics. This doesn't meet the requirements of what we normally think of when we talk about something that is good in an aesthetic sense. That's what I mean. So, and metal is full of failures in that regard. It's too fast or too slow. It's too loud. It's too noisy. It fails to contain itself properly and be nice and pleasant.
Yeah, see, I definitely, obviously agree with that second one. The first one, I think there is shit metal and then there's good metal.
I think that's of course that's true as well. You're absolutely right.
That actually leads into the next question I got, because I often think about, it's about classical music. The question is metal versus classical music, the complexity and how does it affect the human brain?
Oh my God.
You know, I think personally metal kind of gets the closest as a modern genre to classical music, compared to pop music, compared to hip hop, you know, compared to indie or whatever. I think metal gets the closest to that grandeur of classical, and so therefore you could make an argument that it is better. It is more complex and grand and thought out, and therefore it's better. But
sure,
I don't know whether you want to answer that or combine it with the question.
Okay, let me put it like this: metal isn't good; it's great. I mean great in a capital G, like grandiose, concerned with big ideas, concerned with like the trying to be epic, you know, trying to be the loudestness, is how one journalist described it. Now, this doesn't necessarily make it good though, because what's good to most people often involves a nice ditty that they can whistle. And metal doesn't offer that. Metal isn't tuneful, and it isn't nice to listen to when you're just getting on with your day to day for most people. Obviously, if you're a hard-boiled head, then it's different. But it's not pleasant, you know. Maybe what I'm trying to really point at is that when people normally talk about what's good, they normally mean something that's nice and pleasant. And I hear those words normally and run like hell. Like, I don't want to hear something that's pleasant or nice. I want to hear something that's foul and great, great and terrible in the biblical terminology. You know, something that's like it's powerful and it's awe-inspiring, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's easy to work with. It's a challenge, you know, as we've said a few times before. And classical music, symphonic music perhaps, is challenging. But chamber classical is not. Chamber classical is designed to not be listened to. It's designed to be background music. And that stuff has a lot more in common, I think, with indie or like pop writing than metal does. But where metal fits into Western art music is, the big fucking symphony, where it's loud, it's long, it's too loud, it's too long, etc. I know that lots of people compare classical music to metal, not just in journalism, but also in academia. People like making that link. And I can see that. I think that metal actually has one up on classical music because classical music doesn't have amps. So they were never able to like tickle your guts in the same way that metal can. Like it can't, like when you watch, like I saw Sun for the first time earlier this year, and that gut rumble, that feeling that all of your internal organs are being jiggled about while you listen to this music. You can't get that with any symphony orchestra because they're just not loud enough. And that touches us somewhere beyond neurology. It touches us in all the way up and down the body. Now, I think perhaps metal, compared to other forms of pop music, maybe scratches the higher cerebral functions a little bit more because it's complicated. And certainly you go to you look at the way that death metal fans will listen to music with complicated time signatures, where they know to change their headbang to go in time with the 11/8 bar or whatever. Now that for sure takes a bit of thought, but for me it's almost moot. I don't mean to say I can kind of understand where the question's coming from, because you want to say that metal is elevated like classical music is perceived to be elevated, but I would say the real thing is that metal outstrips classical.
Yeah, it's a full body experience.
Yeah, and it can be cerebral, so it actually it's in excess of what classical music can do. Until you get to the really avant-garde classical, where it's like Stockhausen's Concerto for Helicopters. That shit's brutal.
I like to listen to Radio 3 a lot, and
I love Radio 3.
Yeah, I enjoy so much of their output. I think it's the best radio station for music lovers, because all they do is talk about actual music. There's no talk about celebrity or trends or anything like that. They are talking about the emotion of music and how it makes you feel, and you just don't get that anywhere else. But it reminds me of metal in that way.
Yeah,
you get those two things between classical and metal. So I love listening to Radio 3, but then if you keep listening towards like midnight, you'll start to get the modern classical music shows on, and I just can't do them, because
I love it.
For me, they go beyond even metal. For me, that is bad. I would use that word, bad. It's because it's not enjoyable, and it doesn't tickle me in that extreme way either. It just sounds... No. But that's just me.
There's no visceral supplement to the challenge. Exactly. You know, like when you listen to metal, at least you get this gut punch feeling back, where it's like, oh yeah, that was hard. But with contemporary classical, it's all challenge. It's just this is hard to listen to.
Yeah.
I really like it, but as you know, but I'm weird about it, you know.
Third question here, last question. Metal is often seen as evolving from blues, and if any such influence exists from the intensity of the late 50s to late 60s free jazz movement, it is rarely cited. Do you think there are any ties or parallels here, overlooked or otherwise? So my friend Joe's asking about specifically free jazz, but we could talk about just jazz.
Well, okay, so accepting the band that I am in, that is extremely inspired by free jazz, there aren't many moments, I think. I think look, there's accidental free jazz all over Slayer, for instance. There's all of that stupid, like, completely not thought through soloing that Kerry King does, where it's just like all of that touches on free jazz, but he's not playing it like a free jazzer. He's just improvising and not worrying about where the fingers land, and that's got a bit of free jazz spirit, but I don't think it's a conscious influence. I think now, though, just in the recent past, there are more bands that are bringing this kind of musical chaos further into how metal works, largely on the periphery. with very occasional exceptions, I say, like, I think Imperial Triumphant do little bits of jazz fusion and free jazz-ish bits in their work, but that isn't really free. It's all still largely written. But they did have that bit with Kenny G doing a solo over the top of one of their songs, didn't they? So that was nice. But I think in the past 5 to 10 years we've started to see more artists and bands that are working with like improvisation and free jazz kinds of approaches, and I'm really excited for it. I guess the band ZU from Italy, they're kind of a forerunner as well, but it really is a kind of marginalia to try and chart how free jazz and metal intersect.
I think in my head, jazz, in some ways, it's the opposite of metal, because jazz, it is freedom, and it's just complete batshit insane stuff. Metal, to me, it's very locked down, and it's very just on the beat, usually. And so, to me, they feel like completely different things. Metal doesn't... obviously, you can improvise, but maybe that's why your band is going to be so unique and maybe interesting for a lot of people, but they feel like opposing forces in my head sometimes.
I think that there are only a couple of cases where I've heard of it working, but before the John Zorn stuff, but a lot of that is written too. It's not all free. And then do you know Sumac? The past 2 or 3 albums, they've mixed improvised sections with written sections on. But Sumac are largely like that project lives in the studio and then goes out to tour. So that probably came from them fiddling around, taking a long time and being patient with it, and then once they've got it down, then they'll learn it and lock it down. Because yeah, you're right. Like metal is tight, jazz is loose, or at least in the way that we're talking about it. Not all jazz is loose. Some jazz is real fucking tight. But when it was swing bands and stuff, largely that is extremely tight. Like I'm a trombonist. I've played in big bands and that kind of thing. And you really have to like try and nail the part and be and play at the exact same time as 15 other people. But
I think that's free jazz was. It was the abolishment.
Free jazz is the absolute opposite to that, and it's completely loose. And yeah, I think there's part of the reason I started the band was nobody else is doing this right now, and this could be an interesting avenue for metal to push through. Is right, well, we've got folk metal, we've got like fusion jazz metal, you've got like noodly jazz metal like Cynic and whatever. But what about if we take it even further into the avant-garde and even further into, horrible compositional forms that nobody likes listening to, like free jazz or like avant-garde classical? Like, why not there,
Now that I know you like modern classical, it all starts to make a lot more sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, the one experience I've had with improvisation, I actually touched on it on the episode of the podcast we've just released, because it was with John from Conan, and me and him had we had a drone band called DOS, and we played one gig, and it basically was improvised because John said, book a gig in for me, for us in Sheffield, and it'll be our first gig. And I was like, okay. I was like, we've not really got any songs. Are you going to come down in the day and we'll have a jam and we'll get some stuff written that we can like base a set around? And he was like, yeah, I'll come down to Sheffield around lunchtime. Don't worry. He turned up around 5:30 in Sheffield, and obviously the doors were at like 7 or whatever. So I was like, all right, come on then, let's go and have a jam and figure this stuff out. And obviously, very limited. We had an hour and a half, and we basically improvised the whole set, and against my will. But I am really glad I had that as an experience, because it was not enjoyable in the slightest for me, and I don't think it was for John either. I felt like completely out in the open and like naked, and it was like I was very aware that this could go off the rails at any moment. And, you know, a pat on the back for both of us. I think we held it together really well. And when I got off stage, you know, some people were like, that was really good. And I said, you do realise we improvised that? And they were like, no. But it's not an experience I want to ever really repeat.
I get that. So I find the vulnerability and the exposure very exciting. Like because the sense that it could all fall apart, and the band is just bass and drums and vocals at the moment. So it really is like on both of us. If either of us stop playing, then the whole thing's fucked. The other side to it is that the punters don't know. They have no idea. They're in the same way that when you fluff a note, nobody cares because nobody knows. Largely, it's also like that for improvisation. Nobody knows that it's improvised if the amp is loud enough, because then they're just enjoying the viscerality of it, and they don't have to think about it.
I've literally heard, I think it was the guitarist from Dillinger Escape Plan say that's why he enjoyed the nature of their music so much, is because you could play it wrong and no one would ever know.
Nobody or care.
Yeah.
Even if they did know, it doesn't make a difference, because I think on a more fundamental level, we just enjoy really, really loud noises that feel like getting hit in the stomach, and what sequence they arrive in is kind of lesser importance.
Well, fair play to you. And yeah, I think it's definitely going to be a more unique project for you there. So we've been talking for over an hour and a half now. So this is by far the longest one I've recorded so far. I think just to finish it off, I think I've touched on what metal means to me. It's partly about embracing being an outsider in terms of wider society, and more obviously it's a reckoning with darkness, and then you've kind of added on top of that it's about making the esoteric and the dark and making it obvious. But yeah, just to finish off, if you had to sum up what metal is to you in a very succinct phrase, what would it be?
Metal is a struggle with the real. The real is a psychoanalytic concept. It means what we can't symbolise. But I also feel that the word real is so important because of how metal fans use that word. Metal is more real than the other popular musics, it's so often claimed. It's not just about being true, it's about being real. Talking about the real world. But for me, it's a struggle with the thing that we do not understand.
So it's, yeah.
And that is the realest shit, is the addition to that.
So that's implying that other forms of music are engaging with things that can be symbolised and translated and put in a box, could you say?
More so. Absolutely more so. Yeah, like punk deals with the social reality. It deals with the concrete world of social movements. Hip-hop deals with personal struggle, personal stories, and the African-American experience, which again is a concrete thing. Reggae deals with the Jamaican experience, you know? All of these folk musics deal with a particular culture, a particular time and place. Metal doesn't, really. Metal, wherever it goes, all over the world, it just finds new ways of dealing with what we cannot properly understand.
Really good note to end it on there, I think. Fascinating. Really enjoyed talking to you. So, we'll end it there, and thanks again.
Thanks very much, Joe. It's been great.
If you enjoyed that, you'll be pleased to know I've got loads more episodes planned with guests from the UK and more further afield, so hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and stay tuned for those episodes. Peace.